Okay, thanks everyone for coming back so promptly. I hope your welfare has been improved by some caffeine. My name is Hugh Gollidge. I'm Chief Executive of the University's Federation for Animal Welfare, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session on welfare in, I'm going to insert the word so-called pest control there, because as we heard this morning, I think pest is a rightly contentious term. And as we heard also this morning, if ever an issue has shone a spotlight on the way we treat animals, depending upon the context in which we meet them, it would be pest control. And if we think about rats and mice, we encounter these species as pets, as the backbone of biomedical research, even as livestock. They're often farmed for food for other animals, and as pests. And the standards we apply to them are vastly different depending on those contexts. As research animals, we spend endless hours ethically reviewing what we do to them. We only allow procedures to be carried out on them by qualified people who are supervised and regularly inspected. And yet when we meet those exact same species as pests, we allow unqualified, unmonitored members of the public to kill them by numerous methods which we know to be inhumane. So recently we've seen a great step forward with the glue traps bill, which was mentioned this morning, which will significantly reduce the use of glue traps and limit them to the use of professionals in England. Hopefully we'll be seeing similar or ideally even stronger legislation from the Scottish and Welsh governments in the near future. But that, I think, is only really the start, removing one inhumane way of controlling pests. And there's a lot more work to be done to think about the way we control rats and mice and numerous other so-called pest species. So I'm delighted today that we've got two speakers who can help us address that issue. First up, we'll be having a general introduction to the issue of pest control from Dr. Liz Molyneux, who's a member of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee and a trustee of. And then following that, Dr. Sandra Baker from Oxford will be talking about some research which I'm delighted U4 co-funded with the AWF, looking at the actual welfare impacts of methods for controlling rats. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Liz to come up and introduce the topic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you to the Animal Welfare Foundation for the invite to speak today. I'm going to introduce the subject of welfare in pest control. I'm conscious that in this talk I've only included vertebrate examples, and we perhaps should be also thinking about invertebrate species as well. So what is a pest? We're lucky enough to share this planet with some really remarkable animals, and yet even in a group of veterinary professionals and other welfare specialists, I know you'll all be looking at these pictures in a different way. So what do you see? Do you see this? Or do you maybe see this? Because the language we use to describe these animals really impacts upon the way that we think about them, and then impacts upon the way we treat them, often compromising their welfare. And the language that we use is included in a negative way in our legislation and in the way our government bodies talk about these animals. And here are a couple of examples, including DEFRA's recent advice for controlling vermin in avian influenza protection zones. But this is not a new concept. The Preservation of Grain Act, passed in 1532 by Henry VIII and strengthened by Elizabeth I, made it compulsory for every landowner and worker to kill as many vermin as possible. And this included kingfishers, dippers, woodpeckers, hedgehogs and otters, as well as what we would consider the usual suspects. Kites and ravens fetch remuneration of a penny, and a badger or fox or an otter a shilling on presentation of their head as proof of their demise. Those failing in this task of killing could be fined 20 shillings, which was obviously quite a lot of money. And in many ways, our attitudes to these species have perhaps not changed terribly since the 1500s. There's an old gardening saying that a weed is just a plant in the wrong place, But in gardening, we've moved forward away from our very manicured lawns of the 1970s and structural block planting into what we consider a more naturalistic approach. So the garden on the left looks not dissimilar to the Cornish lane in the middle. So is a pest animal just an animal that's in the wrong place, or is it more than that? And has everyone spotted the porcupine? What we consider to be a pest also varies over time. In the 1800s, our native red squirrel numbers were really low, but boosted by Scandinavian imports and changes in forestry, they were re-established in such large numbers that by the end of that century, they were considered to be pests again. They were then killed in hundreds of thousands, so they then became endangered. Around about the same time, grey squirrels were introduced to the country and became the dominant species because of their increased adaptability and their resistance to squirrel pox. So the grey squirrel became the pest and the red the protector species. There are also some inconsistencies to our attitudes to introduced species. When they're introduced and there's an economic benefit, we might feel differently about them. And one person's pest is not necessarily another. The fox cub's caught in a snare. The other fox has been fed, perhaps a bit excessively, in somebody's garden. And attitudes also change with experience, particularly when the animals fail to realise that there are rules and that becoming over-habituated to people is not the right thing to do. So in these two instances, the language that we use becomes important again. The fox didn't attack the baby boy in his own home. But wild animals do have to live alongside human beings, and there are instances where they can be problematic to our environments, our domestic animal welfare, commercial enterprises, and our own health. And where human health and safety in particular is concerned, these dangers shouldn't be underestimated. And in such situations, it's generally accepted that some sort of management of these animals might be required. Wild animal management, perhaps inappropriately termed pest control, is big business. And in many situations, it's considered socially acceptable and takes place through commercial organisations with some degree of self-regulation. Wildlife management is also in the hands of landowners who may kill or take named species for defined reasons under government general licences, the provision of which has recently been wildly debated in the press. Untrained lay people, the general public, do also attempt to manage wild animals that they consider to be pests, with posts on social media suggesting a variety of homemade methods and readily available commercial products, such as glue traps, and control methods for both lethal and non-lethal control. The negative welfare implications for those animals involved are considerable. So what's the solution? Where there's a need to manage wildlife, it's appropriate that we follow some ethical and welfare principles, and this infographic illustrates the steps in ethical wildlife control outlined by Sarah Dubois and others in their 2017 paper. These principles have recently been referred to in British Veterinary Association policy position statements on both on tuberculosis, the use of rodent glue traps, and snaring. The first of the Dubois principles involves beginning to modify human practices. And this can be as simple as avoiding feeding rodents when we provide food to birds, picking up fallen stock, avoiding having open grain stores, and not feeding the gulls at the seaside. We can also actively exclude animals by storing food correctly, not throwing waste materials on the streets of our towns and cities, using electric fences or steel wool or noisy deterrents. Where we do consider wildlife management interventions, both lethal and non-lethal, to be necessary, we should continue to follow the Dubois principles. We should justify our actions with evidence and ensure our objectives are clear and achievable. And then we must prioritise animal welfare. It would seem unlikely that many of the methods that we use to control wildlife would be acceptable in other species, or even, as others have already suggested, they wouldn't be acceptable in the same species in different circumstances. For example, what's acceptable for that wild mouse would not be acceptable as a way of euthanizing a pet mouse, or certainly a laboratory mouse. Many wildlife control methods seem to compromise some, if not all, of the 5 domains for animal welfare. Prioritising animal welfare in wildlife control should also extend to non-target species, and many of the methods of wildlife management have unintended consequences for these and might also compromise the welfare of dependent young. These 2 images, however distressing, actually show some progress. The trap type on the left has now largely been replaced on places like Grousemoor with rail traps that only allow access to certain species, usually small mustelids, rather than rabbit that this picture shows. The blackbird on the glue trap on the right was found in a pet superstore and promoted a public petition to the Scottish Parliament, which will hopefully soon lead to a ban on at least the public sale and use of glue traps in Scotland to follow the new legislation introduced in England. There's currently, however, very little research into the comparative welfare impacts of many of the methods that we use to control wildlife, both lethal and non-lethal. And this makes this piece of work by Sandra Baker and others of particular interest and value. Before I hand over to Sandra, I'd like to thank my fellow members of WALK for the inspiration for this talk, and to thank others for their kind permission to use some of the images I've included. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz, for a wonderful introduction. There's an awful lot for us to think about in that. We're going to think about one of the issues, which is working out what the impacts of pest control might be on rats, with Dr. Sandra Baker from the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University.
Oops. Sorry. Thank you, Hugh, and thanks very much, Liz, to that fantastic introduction to animal welfare in the world of pest control. I'm going to focus in now on a study we conducted recently, actually together with Hugh and with Liz and several others, to assess the animal welfare impacts that occur in using several different methods of managing Norway rats. So I've called this first slide a meeting of the minds because the work was very much a collaboration. The first thing I did when I began the project was to gather together a group of expert stakeholders with expertise in rodent control, rodent biology, wildlife management, animal welfare science, and veterinary science and medicine. And I think the strength of the work that we did lies in the level of agreement achieved by this very diverse range of experts. And this is the citation for the paper. I'll be giving that again at the end if anyone's interested. It's available open access through the journal Animal Welfare. Okay, so we had 3 aims in this study, and the main aim was to assess the relative animal welfare impacts of 6 different lethal rat management methods. First of all, we looked at snap trapping. Snap traps are kind of the standard Tom and Jerry traps that you'll all be familiar with, and they're intended to kill rats and mice by crushing the back of the skull or the upper cervical vertebrae. And in this country, and almost everywhere else in the world, snap traps are unregulated, and that's in contrast to virtually all the other spring traps in the UK. We also looked at 2 methods of live capture followed by humane dispatch using a concussive blow to the head, and these were cage trapping and glue trapping. We finally looked at 3 different baiting methods, and the first of those was perhaps the most well-known, and you'll all have heard of them, anticoagulant rodenticides. As you probably know, these act by disrupting blood clotting, causing internal hemorrhaging and external bleeding. We also looked at cholecalciferol, which is another rodenticide, and it's often recommended as an alternative to anticoagulants in geographical areas where anticoagulant resistance has evolved. Cholecalciferol is actually the naturally occurring form of vitamin D, and it acts by increasing intestinal absorption of calcium, but in high doses it also mobilizes calcium from the bones in the skeleton and causes calcification of the major arteries around the heart and heart and kidneys specifically. And finally, we looked at non-toxic lethal cellulose baits, and this is supplied to rodents as a non-toxic food source that interferes with their digestive system and results in lethal dehydration. We had 2 other aims in the study. First of all, to identify ways of reducing animal welfare impacts in the methods that we assessed, and also to highlight areas where there are data missing and data that would be useful for improving welfare assessments in the future. There were several different stages to the project. First of all, I drafted a set of standard operating procedures for the 6 different methods, so 1 SOP per method. And it's very important to have these standard operating procedures against which to make the welfare assessments, because they detail exactly how the procedure must be conducted, and any slight change in the procedure used can have quite a big impact on the welfare outcomes that occur. So I did that work in collaboration with pest controllers that were part of my stakeholder group that I mentioned just now. And the standard operating procedures were designed to reflect current best practice in the UK. The second step was to do a literature review, looking for all kinds of evidence of potential animal welfare impacts of any of the 6 methods. Not only impacts on rats, but other animals too, because sometimes there wasn't enough information on rats specifically, and also sometimes information about impacts of poisons on humans. And then ultimately, I facilitated 2 animal welfare assessment workshops. And the workshops were attended by my group of 15 stakeholder experts. And my job was to guide them through the use of an animal welfare assessment model and to encourage between the stakeholders discussion and reference to the standard operating procedures and the animal welfare literature that I provided, so that they could reach consensus on animal welfare impact score for each of the 6 methods. So I used a model that was developed by Australian government scientists Trudy Sharp and Glenn Saunders. They did that in conjunction with experts and stakeholders there, and because they did it that way, the model has received widespread kind of acceptance among the pest control community, which is fantastic. And indeed, the model has been used in Australia for assessing welfare impacts against a whole range of species there, including rabbits, goats, camels, foxes, deer, birds, wild dogs, feral cats, horses, pigs, and donkeys. The model has also been used in New Zealand, and I've used it previously in the UK. So the model, you don't really need to know very much about the details of the model, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit to help you understand the results that I'll be presenting in a second. So the model has 2 parts, basically. They're called Part A and Part B. But what you need to know is that Part A relates to animal welfare impacts that are related to non-lethal components of a method, and Part B relates to the animal welfare impact of any killing method that's involved. So the non-lethal impacts are assessed using a system that's based on Mellor and Reed's 5 domains model that Liz mentioned earlier. And that 5 domains model was originally based on the Farm Animal Welfare Council's 5 freedoms. So the 5 domains in the 5 domains model are basically 4 physical domains: nutrition, environment, health, behavioural and interactive restriction. And those are considered to then produce welfare impacts under the fifth domain, which is mental state, and that's what we're interested in when we're talking about animal welfare. The other part of the model that looks at the welfare impact of the killing method involved is based on Donald Broom's criteria for assessing killing methods, and he said that the welfare impact of a killing method would be a product of the severity of any poor welfare before death and the duration of that poor welfare. And of course, what's actually important is the severity of any poor welfare before the animal becomes irreversibly unconscious rather than dies, and that's important in considering some of the pest control methods that we look at. But happily, the Sharp and Saunders model interprets it in that way and looks at time to irreversible unconsciousness. So these are the results. I'll just talk you through those, but sorry, I meant to say, before I left that last slide, that both parts of the model basically function by providing sets of welfare impact scales with examples of different kinds of welfare impact, quite specific examples in some cases, which are very useful for helping whoever's doing the assessments to select categories from a list of categories of level of welfare impact and duration of welfare impact. Okay, so now on to the results. You can see here two axes. The y-axis up the side is for presenting the results on Part A of the model, which is the non-lethal impacts, whereas the axis along the bottom presents the results for welfare impacts of killing methods. And you can see that the results of the non-lethal methods up the side are in the form of numbers between 1 and 8, and those for the killing methods are in the form of letters between A and H. And the graph shows 4 different grey shaded areas, and the areas 1, 2, and 3 relate to snap trapping, cage trapping, and glue trapping. Whilst the fourth one, excuse me, the fourth one provides the results for all 3 of the baiting methods, which happen to get exactly the same score. So looking at the graph, the welfare impact increases as you move from bottom left up to the top right. So that means that methods that have ended up on the periphery, so at the very top or the very right-hand side, are those with the greatest welfare impact scores. You can see the welfare impact scores listed after each of the methods on the right-hand side in the key of the graph there. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one at a time. First of all, we'll look at glue trapping. So glue trapping, followed by killing with a concussive blow to the head, obviously has 2 parts to it. The first is the actual trapping in the glue, and the other is the killing of the rat with a concussive blow. And the stakeholders' assessments discovered that it's the glue trapping, the protracted period of glue trapping, that is the most severe of the 2 parts. So I'm going to tell you in detail about the results of the glue trapping and then just very briefly about the concussive blow. So the stakeholders decided that glue trapping had an extreme impact on animal welfare and that this lasted for several hours. And they had high levels of confidence in both those factors. The main welfare impacts of glue trapping were health and behavioural related. So in terms of health, animals that get stuck on the glue, they can tear their own skin, break their own bones, and chew through their own limbs as they struggle to escape. Sometimes their eyes and mouths become glued shut because the more they struggle, the deeper they get drawn into the glue. And after a few hours, they can be covered in their own feces and urine, and they may die of suffocation in the glue or from exhaustion, even though this is supposed to be a live capture device. Obviously, once they're stuck, their behaviour is entirely restricted, and they're unable to do all sorts of things that you would normally expect them to do, including escaping from predators and even cannibalism by other rats caught on the same trap. In terms of the impacts on their mental state, the rats are likely to be anxious, experiencing pain, fear, panic, distress, hunger, thirst, and breathlessness. Then the pest controller comes along to dispatch the rat, and the stakeholders' assessments determined that the killing itself would have a mild to moderate impact lasting for seconds to minutes, and they were also highly confident about that. And again, the impacts of the actual killing process were largely due to behavioural restrictions where the rat can't escape as the pest controller approaches to conduct the humane dispatch. Okay, now we're going to look at the baiting methods, and I'll do them one at a time because they scored the same score but for very different reasons. So anticoagulants were deemed to have a severe to extreme level of impact lasting for several days, extreme being the highest category available in the model. The stakeholders had medium and high confidence in those two factors. The majority of the impacts were health-related, although there were others. So hemorrhaging occurs into body organs and cavities, and if bleeding happens into the lungs, then that can lead to reduced respiratory function, and animals are likely to die by anemia or hypovolemic shock. They'll be experiencing severe pain, breathlessness, lethargy, weakness, thirst, dizziness, anxiety, and fear, and it's thought that they remain conscious throughout the whole period that they're poisoned until they die. With cholecalciferol, which is the other rodenticide, again, a severe to extreme impact lasting for days, and this time the stakeholders had high confidence in both those factors. The bulk of the welfare impacts came from a wider range of domains this time, so there were nutritional impacts where animals were unlikely to eat or drink, health impacts, so animals were experiencing osteomalacia, which is softening of the bones, calcification of blood vessels around the heart and lungs, and ultimately, most likely, heart and lung failure. Behaviourally, as before, they're unable to forage or escape predators just because they're just debilitated so badly. And in terms of their mental state, they'll be experiencing pain, nausea, lethargy, weakness, listlessness, thirst, breathlessness, fear, anxiety, and confusion. And again, all the evidence suggests that they remain conscious throughout. And then the third baiting method, which was cellulose baiting, also had a severe to extreme impact lasting for days. And the stakeholders, again, had a very high level of confidence in that. The impacts included nutritional ones and also health impacts, such as the cellulose accumulating in the gut and causing gut obstruction, and that then leads to extraction of fluid from the blood system, which produces hypovolemia and reduced blood pressure and a reduction of oxygen to the tissues, and ultimately multi-organ failure or circulatory shock. The animals are likely to experience severe gastrointestinal pain and discomfort, as well as nausea, weakness, dizziness, hunger, anxiety, and fear. And again, they're thought to remain conscious throughout. So now we're going to talk about cage trapping. And as with the glue trapping, the stakeholders' assessments suggested that it's the period of being trapped in the cage which has the bigger of the welfare impacts compared to the concussive blow, although of course both are important. So they decided that cage trapping had a moderate to severe impact which lasted for hours, and they had a medium level of confidence in the moderate to severe impact and a high level in the duration. Behaviourally, as before with the glue trap, to a certain extent, they're unable to forage, move, care for pups, escape the attention of predators and so on, and they're likely to experience fear and distress. And then finally, here are the results for snap trapping. So the stakeholders allocated the widest possible range of categories for the type of impact to snap trapping, ranging from no impact, which would be when a trap causes immediate irreversible unconsciousness and has no impact whatsoever on the animal's welfare, right through to the other end of the spectrum with an extreme impact. And they thought that this was most likely to last for seconds up to minutes. And they had low and medium levels of confidence, perhaps not surprisingly, about this. And the reason for this uncertainty and the lack of confidence is because the snap traps, they're not regulated, never have been, so there's been no incentive to measure the welfare impacts of snap trapping. And this means that there's been a whole range of snap traps have proliferated of different designs and so on, and nobody knows what impacts they have. So there's uncertainty in terms of the health impacts that might occur, although we can have a good idea of what the types that may happen, because of variation in trap strike location and trap power. This is likely to affect injury type and the mode of death. So rats are likely to experience potentially hemorrhaging, paralysis, asphyxiation, occlusion of blood flow to the brain, compression of the heart and lungs, and potentially hemorrhagic shock or heart failure. And it's not known at what point they do or don't become unconscious under any of those scenarios. There are behavioural restrictions, of course, too, for any rats that aren't irreversibly unconscious immediately. They're unable to escape, and they're likely to experience pain, fear, and severe distress. So in summary of the results, the stakeholders concluded that the greatest welfare impacts among the methods that we looked at were produced by the 3 baiting methods and by glue trapping followed by a concussive blow to the head, and that from a purely welfare perspective, they should be considered a last resort. Lower welfare impacts were produced by cage trapping, and highly variable impacts are likely to happen from snap trapping. But if you can get a good snap trap, then this could potentially be the most welfare-friendly option assessed. And we do know that there are some snap traps that have been properly tested now in Germany under their Blue Angel scheme, which are capable of causing unconsciousness within a very few seconds. So it's not as if these things aren't available. So in the paper, we made the statement that given our findings and the dependency of the pest control industry, or the rodent control industry on anticoagulants, that rat management may be the greatest anthropogenic impact on wild animal welfare. So you might say, well, what can we do with your results? Well, the animal welfare impact scores that the stakeholders produced that were plotted on the graph, they can be used in conjunction with at least 2 already existing frameworks to help in the consideration of animal welfare when making decisions about rat management, alongside other factors like efficacy and safety and cost, and non-target welfare and public acceptability. The first of those frameworks is the Campaign for Responsible Rodenticide Use Risk Hierarchy. And this is a set of stepwise measures for preventing and removing rodent populations. And the risk hierarchy emphasises using proofing and the removal of harbourage, but that when lethal management is needed, you should use the least severe method that's considered to be effective. And now Liz has already mentioned the 7 principles framework, but our results can be used with that also, because one of the principles is to, again, use the method with the least welfare impact that is likely to be effective. So, of course, we had 2 other aims, not just the one about the relative welfare impacts. The first of those other 2 aims was to work out ways of potentially reducing the welfare impacts that we've identified. And first of all, the obvious one is to prevent and minimise population establishment in the first place. But also, more specifically, choosing a good quality snap trap or using a cage trap, followed by an effective concussive blow to the head where possible, over baiting methods or glue traps. And where cage traps are used, covering them and supplying food, water and bedding. And where any traps are used at all, checking them more frequently and potentially using remote sensing to monitor them, to absolutely minimise the amount of time that animals spend in traps, because that's the key factor there. And in terms of snap traps also, we need more information about which traps cause irreversible unconsciousness the most quickly. And one way of doing that would be to include snap traps in the standard regulation for spring traps in the UK, although I would say that the acceptance approval criteria would have to be vastly restricted for rat traps compared to the criteria that are used currently. Also, an alternative is a voluntary certification scheme, and there are moves afoot on that front too. The pest controllers felt that there should be improved training in in conducting a concussive blow to the head is a difficult thing to do for anyone, and so there is a plan also to create a sensitive training video to help with that. Something that's been suggested in the past is to develop rodenticides incorporating analgesics, sedatives, or general anaesthetics. So that's another possibility too. In terms of missing data that we identified, we need more information, as I said, on the time to unconsciousness in snap traps, information on the prevalence of different welfare impacts experienced by rats in snap traps and cage traps, and also information on welfare impacts experienced by rats that are cage trapped and then need to be killed with a concussive blow. They need to be transferred to a sack in order to do that, and there's no information on what that process or impact that process has on their welfare, because it obviously involves a lot of interaction with a human. Other improvements could be to improve welfare training available to pest control technicians, to better inform the public on the need for good hygiene, proofing and environmental management, and better enforcement of food safety and health and safety legislation. And I'll finish there by thanking my sponsors for this work, who are the Animal Welfare Foundation and the University's Federation for Animal Welfare, along with the Eleanor Patterson Baker Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for that unflinching summary of the impacts of rodent control. It's a really important subject, and I think the real achievement of that work was bringing together all of the stakeholders to agree those impacts so that they have real weight behind them, because everyone has come to a consensus that these methods really do have serious welfare impacts in some situations. So let's ask some questions, and there's a very pertinent one that always comes up on the online one. Oh, sorry, before I do that, I should give you your instructions about online questions. So do submit your questions on Slido if you're in the room using your mobile phone, or virtual delegates can do that by clicking on the Stage tab and then the Slido tab. And people in the room can also stick their hands up and ask a face-to-face question if you'd like to. But we've already got some virtual ones on the iPad, and the first one is one, as I said, that comes up very often, which is if all the lethal control methods have impacts on animal welfare, can't we use non-lethal methods such as fertility control or live capture and release? So I guess well, you probably both have opinions on that, but Sandra, why don't you start, seeing as you've spoken to everyone?
So there is a brand of fertility control that's just started to be used in America. It's not approved for use in the UK or Europe currently. It's called Pest. Unfortunately, there are no data yet on the welfare impacts of using fertility control on rats, but it will have impacts. So, for example, it could affect their behaviour, aggression, sociality, and their appetite. Also, of course, fertility control won't be usable in the way that many rodent control methods are used. It's not going to be a quick fix for removing rodents that have suddenly appeared in a house or a factory or a school or a hospital. It might be a very useful part of a longer-term management plan. So other than that, another method that people sometimes suggest and are keen to do is to live catch rats and release them somewhere else. But again, we have no animal welfare information on that, and that won't be without its welfare impacts too. It might make people feel better, and it's easier, potentially, than dealing with a dead rat. But if you release an animal of any kind into an area where it wasn't in the first place, then you're potentially not only impacting that animal, but the animals that are already there. So that's definitely an area that needs some work. But hopefully data will start to become available on the use of Pest as a fertility control agent soon, and there is hope for the future, perhaps that some of the rat control will be more humane.
Liz, did you have thoughts on whether we can use non-lethal methods?
Yeah, I guess to broaden it to other species, we've looked at reproductive control as a method of controlling the badger population, and we can do that in a research setting. But there's a lack of field trials around that, and badgers really social animals, big social structure. If you start messing with reproduction, that could have some really major welfare consequences. So it's really moving these things, I guess, from the lab into the field. In terms of moving animals somewhere else, that's something we would really avoid in things like wildlife rehabilitation. You know, we've put animals back exactly where they came from because that's their territory, and they don't get into territorial disputes, they know how to find food. So it would kind of go against everything that we talk about in other areas if we started trapping pests and moving them elsewhere.
And I guess what we haven't said, at least with the rodents, is if you just trap them and release them back into your back garden, they'll be back in your house before you know it. So the very least you're going to have to do is take some serious proofing action, and in that case they'll probably just turn up in your neighbour's house, who will go and poison them instead. So I suspect it may not be the solution. Someone online is being very controversial. They asked, or they say, hunting with dogs or ferrets may seem unpalatable, but is it actually high welfare pest control, I guess, compared to the methods Sandra spoke about?
So I think what Sandra established looking at rats and what we feel about pest control generally is that the best method is the one that best mimics what we would consider humane slaughter. So, you know, it's rapid death or rapid loss of consciousness and not that not reversing. So that's where hunting becomes an issue. It's, you know, it isn't instantaneous. Those animals are chased for very long periods of time often. So I think in most instances where you might hunt with dogs, you could shoot. And, you know, speaking to sort of gamekeepers a bit about this, there is improving technology, you know, better laser sights, things like that, in order to be able to dispatch animals really quickly. And a lot of what I think we need to discuss is how do we move to these better welfare solutions. We've talked about snaring recently at BVA, and, you know, that at one point everybody would have said is necessary, but even talking to gamekeepers now in many instances, they're thinking it's not because the technology's there. So it's often forcing people to use the new and improved methods.
Yeah, I'd like to add actually just something in support of what Liz said. A study that we did in 2020, 22 years ago, looking at the reasons why farmers allowed hunting on their land or didn't allow hunting on their land, and everything behind that. It showed that where they actually had what they considered to be a pest problem, where they were losing livestock, then they were far less likely to let the hunt on their land. They were much more likely to use shooting, and there was no evidence that that hunting was really very useful. So, you know, you've got to bear that in mind as well. What's your reason for doing the hunting in the first place?
There's a follow-up to that question on here again, which is asking specifically about using so-called farm cats to deal with rodents in farms and small holdings. Do you think that might be the exception that proves the rule?
Have you ever watched cats catching mice? It's not always very nice. The lead up to death is not always that great. So yeah, I think they're a deterrent. I would say as a deterrent, having a farm cat's probably really, really good. But in terms of welfare of killing of individual animals, it's going to depend on your cat a bit, but some definitely more likely to play than kill.
Exactly. I'll ask one more from the iPad, and then maybe we'll take some from the room. A big overarching question: do you think we should pay as much attention to the welfare of pests as the welfare of domestic animals? Who wants to? Do you want to go first?
Well, I think that may have been touched on in a previous session before I arrived. But I mean, the rat provides a fantastic sort of case study of that, what with them being used as lab animals and highly prized pets, as well as being considered pests. I mean, my answer to that question is why wouldn't you treat them the same? They're all sentient animals. If you start thinking that that it's okay to treat them differently, that suggests some form of blame, really, for what they're doing. I mean, they're just living their lives. And I think the standards should be expected to be the same, really. I know it's much harder to control the circumstances with a wild rat, but where you're impacting on its welfare, I think you should try to meet the same standards.
Liz, anything?
Yeah, I guess taking that from a slightly different perspective, I think our domestic animals we clearly have a different type of responsibility for. We're absolutely responsible for fulfilling their 5 welfare needs. Whereas animals in the wild's a really tough place. I mean, it is really tough, and I think we need to be careful that we don't try and turn wild animals into pets. But the issue comes about when we intervene. The minute we start intervening, of course, we have a responsibility to make sure that what we do is as welfare friendly as it can be. And I think that is particularly around killing, because a mouse doesn't know if it's a much loved pet or whether it's a laboratory mouse where the standards for care will be really high, or if it's a wild mouse, it's just a mouse. So our thought about that should be the same once we start intervening.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from the room. I saw one hand over in that bottom corner at least.
Hi there. Hello, Josh Lowe from Vet Record. I just wanted to ask, firstly, do you think the glue traps ban goes far enough? Because I think it is still legal to use glue traps to do a licensed pest control, or correct me if I'm wrong about that. And I also just wanted to ask, I'm interested in this bit about preventing or minimising population establishment in the first place, because the reason why I'm interested is that we're all being encouraged to sort of rewild our gardens, you know, to sort of make our gardens friendly for wildlife, whether that's not mowing the lawn or feeding the birds, whatever it happens to be. And of course these animals are wildlife, you know, mice are wildlife. So I just wonder whether there is a potential conflict there in that some of the measures we might take to make our gardens friendlier for wildlife are, surprise, surprise, attracting wildlife, including mice. So how do we prevent or minimise population establishment while making our gardens more friendly environments for wildlife?
Great question. Thanks, Josh. Liz.
Sorry, I forgot what his first question was.
Does the ban on glue traps go far enough because it allows for use
so
by...
it's a step in the right direction. What I suppose matters is how much professionals are allowed to use them and under what circumstances. For example, in New Zealand, it's so heavily licensed and restricted that everyone's stopped applying for a license. So it's effectively nobody's using glue traps. We also felt that there's a lot of potential for some technology. You know, you could have a text message alert that, you know, because the pest controllers all said if you're nearby, that's a real issue. But, you know, we've got all sorts of remote technology, pressure pads, cameras and things. So within the pest controllers, I think there are ways of limiting use, you know, as much as possible. And it might be that then other methods are found and that just goes away. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so it is great that glue traps are going to be banned for use by the public, but as it stands, professional use is still going to be allowed in certain circumstances, and it's not clear what those will be yet. There will be a licensing system as far as I understand, but whether that will be a general licensing system or a class licensing system or an individual system, I don't know. One potential problem is that the circumstances under which pest controllers are supposed to be allowed to continue using glue traps is when there's great need, and that usually involves great urgency, which might provide problems for the process of applying for a very individual sort of case-by-case based license. The other thing that I'd like to say is that the ban is going to be a ban on use but not a ban on sale, which is much harder to implement, I suppose. But this does mean that when people can't, you know, they go to the garden centre to try and buy their glue traps and find that they're no longer allowed to buy them there because the garden centre is being hopefully responsible and not selling them anymore, they will still be allowed to buy them online. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I would just chip in on that is that we don't really have a definition or a qualification for what constitutes a professional pest controller. So making sure that those people who are given a license to use them are competent is going to be important. So I'm going to throw back the other part of that question, which is, I guess, is rewilding and so on going to bring us into more conflict with
So Josh's garden. So I think it's about feeding. Where it goes wrong, an awful lot of the time it's about overly support feeding these animals. So if in your garden you're creating quite a nice balanced ecosystem, then you should be having things that are eating your pest species effectively. Whereas if you're feeding them and you're creating an artificial environment where they are able to breed more, than it's going to go wrong. Obviously that's simplistic because there's loads of stuff we'll do in our garden that definitely will bias the species that are there. But I think if you're trying to keep it as natural as possible and not overly intervene, particularly around feeding, then you're more likely to have a sort of happy situation.
So don't feed the birds, basically.
It's a difficult one, isn't it?
I think it's probably a good idea not to feed the birds too close to the house, and also to make sure that you clear up any spillages and that you store the food that you used to feed the birds with properly rather than just leaving it in a paper bag in the shed. Then people obviously, they also feed other species too, don't they? They like to feed badgers and foxes. Maybe that's not a good idea. The animals are likely to take the food, put it somewhere else nearby. But then I think people also need to, the wider society needs to start to kind of understand that it doesn't matter if you've got rats in your garden, potentially. It's when they get in the house that's a concern. I know people don't like to see rats, but that's a different matter.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Well, amazingly, all our question time has almost flown by. I think we could go on for about another half an hour. I don't know if we can answer any of the other ones offline. But I guess I would just ask if you had any concluding thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap up.
Yeah, so, I mean, hopefully the future will involve fewer infestations and less killing. More work needs to be done to prevent populations arising in the first place. It may be that some pest control companies start offering pest proofing services, which would be a good way to go. I'd like to see more work on adding analgesics and so on to poisons potentially. There was one study by Ferret on that looked promising. And potentially copying a system that's been implemented in Canada called Animal Kind, where different pest control companies can become certified as being humane pest controllers. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they don't do any killing. It means that they follow proper procedures about deciding what to do and when, and then when they do it with welfare in mind.
Thank you. Liz?
Yes, so everything Sandra said. Plus, I think if you're trying to control things yourself, then think first. Think about, what are you doing? What are you trying to achieve? What are the welfare issues associated with that? And whether or not you could do things in a different way, because I think often you could.
Yeah. So I was pondering my next thought. I think that is a really good point, and there's an awful lot to do to educate people about what they should do about this. And if there's one other message that we can just get out over and over again, it's proof your house don't have this problem in the first place, and you won't have to kill anything. I think that's something I would really like to get out there. Thank you for a really fascinating couple of talks and a fascinating topic. I'd just also like to say I'm delighted that you four could work with the AWF on funding this research, which I think was really important, and I hope we can possibly work on some more, because there's clearly an awful lot to do in this area. So thank you all, and I'm going to invite Julian back. Thank you.